So I want to use this presentation as an opportunity to speak, and the first presentation, to speak about the relationship between documentation and design. I will do so with my own work to set some of the lines of inquiry that are the basis of our, at the BP's work, and also our interests with design research. So I've interspersed the presentation with my current research project with a few propositions regarding documentation, fragmentation, fieldwork, and the politics of inventory that hopefully can resonate with some of the discussions we'll have over the next 2 days. I'll be showing a lot of images and not explaining a lot of them, but hopefully it's a nice background to the talk. The research project is called L'Agencement du Commun, so loosely translated, that's about the reassembly of a common world. It's a documentation of municipal interfaces in the city of Montreal. It documents a series of cases across the entire city and its districts, ties connections between them, and seeks to understand how they act as part of the city's public space. And loosely taken, the definition of interface we work with is anything that connects the individual to the city as an administrative entity. To restrict our search, we concentrate on interfaces where a transaction takes place and that have a clear connection to politics, mobility, and therefore access, information, therefore knowledge, and property or a proof of residence. So these include, and from the top left, district service points, recycling centers, individual recycling bins, municipal courts, libraries, police stations, bus stop and validating systems, community centers, and polling stations. The common traits that the cases we are looking at are they're projects managed by the city or its districts and built within the last 20 years. And now, with apologies to those who live here, I will skip the political details of Montreal over the last 20 years to concentrate on the work here. The other trait is that the interfaces are not just between city and individual, but between public and private as well. Spatially and symbolically can therefore be studied as sequence, usually from the sidewalk to the transaction that the interface is built around. And thirdly, interfaces that are part of networks, so that we are looking at distributed fields through some of their singular components. Documentation. And this is where I run through quite a few images here. Documentation requires obsession. Obsession for a subject in all its details and with metronomic repetition until the exhaustion of the subject or the exhaustion of ourselves. Documentation points to the act of tracking, la filature, to follow traces left over by our subject, and to the act of inscription, to leave new traces that can fashion our ways of seeing and composing reality. This double trajectory of documentation should resonate with our interest when we consider the links between documentation, the built environment, and design, because it creates a parallel between drawing as observation and drawing as design, or in other words, between inventory and invention. The cases that we're looking at are for the most part banal, everyday civic architecture where fit for purpose and cost are prime indicators. Some have moments of beauty, surprise, maybe not here. Surprise, some are inspiring, uninspired, some filled with ephemera, accumulation, contradictions. Quite a few places are rented, and they all work on systems that dictate the way in which we should act and can interact with them. And the act following Agamben's definition of the apparatus to capture, orient, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. Succinctly, the project is interested in the architectural and urban dispositions that support the tendency and the potential of public things to become political. This is a recurring problem with public space or political space. Designating something public does not make it so. Public space is a phenomenon that emerges from interaction, from negotiation, from testing out the possibilities of existing structures, or revealing their contradictions. As Dorian Massey astutely wrote, what makes a place genuinely public is precisely the fact that it is contested and negotiated. In my own work, I've come to treat public space from a similar position as something dialogical, constantly remade, and always incomplete. In this case, it would be difficult to restrict ourselves traditional spaces of representation, types, for example, like the street or the town hall in North American culture. But we have to look at the assemblage of the city as a multiple. So the position taken here for the project is that the political emerges from engagement with the civic apparatus and the individual, encounters with other people, objects, and systems framed by different times, delimitations, protocols, practices, connections, and codes. So these are the, I've shown quite a few images of the interface we're actually looking at. These are the 9 cases that we've selected from a larger inventory of the public interfaces in the city. Beyond the rhetoric, these interfaces taken together are a way in which the city territorializes itself and presents itself to us. We are, in this sense, documenting fragments of what is in fact a distributed field that is paradoxically centralized by the city administration and decentralized by the territory it covers. Fragmentation. In working with fragments in the representation of difficult totalities, which documentation implies, we are doing 2 things. One is to express a struggle to find meaning in documenting our subject. Another is to leave this meaning open to interpretation and so to acknowledge the inventory's own failure to complete representation, for complete representation. In writing about Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, Susan Buck-Morss states that one of the contributions of Benjamin's inventory of Paris is to elevate montage as a form of thinking, an edifice accrued from fragments. The work in its posthumous compilation and presentation traces a movement that starts from straightforward documentation to documentation as critique. Benjamin's inventory is witness to an era and a place, and that's Paris of the 19th century, onto which it acts, but also through which we reconstitute the city itself. This idea of testimony, critique, and construction seen together in urban documentation is paramount, of course, to the idea of this conference, and is one of the main methodological lines of the project I'm presenting today. In our own engagement with the interfaces, we follow 3 principal methods: site observation, documentation, analytical drawing, and exploratory drawing. So just to look at, this is the full inventory of and the map is on the wall, this is the full inventory of interfaces in Montreal, but not counting bus stops, for example, or like those distributed transport field. That would be too much to map on a single thing. So what we've done first is to map all of them and then pick out 9 or 10 out of these to study in detail and to draw in detail. I'm going to skip that here. So these projects, for the most part, are not documented. Most of them are interior renovations. This is the Municipal Court South Service Point. It's the one that's presented actually in the exhibition. So they're not documented. Most of them are interior renovations managed internally by the city or by the building owner and with little trace. A lot of the firms who worked on them do not list them as part of their portfolio. Very few are published anywhere. So they demand our interest first as apparatus, as municipal apparatus, but also as a project of inventory to document and to create the documents for these and the testimonies for these places. I'll just go back to field work. The engagement with our subjects creates its own site. Whether by direct or indirect observation, research picks up the traces left by our subjects in a way that makes the act of investigating inseparable from the subject. Borrowing expression from the anthropologist Roy Wagner, field work is an invention of the field. And so a large part of the documentation is in itself an act of constructing our research case. Visual documentation is the first step, and drawing is the next. A first drawing task, and I'm going to run through a few drawings of these cases. A first drawing task is to make sure that these sites and objects appear as constructed. So each case is drawn in the same axonometric projection. This is the recycling center, and that's irrespective of size. So you see this, that's a polling station in a school. That's a police station out east. And the municipal court. and a detail of that drawing. Apart from being another testimony of each case, these drawings act as levelers that connect disparate projects through a common language and grammar. In Montreal, the study transformations to the urban apparatus do not form a coherent political project, but a loose connection of intentions that rarely align. It is because of this, and not in spite, that they demand our attention. Banal or not, they are instruments of power and order, and power is perhaps at its most insidious when it is invisible, banal, disconnected from accountability. In parallel to analytical drawing, we are doing these exploratory exercises, taking for each a common theme across the cases, time, delimitations, protocols, practices, connections, and codes. And these are ways of reassembling interface components in ways that help us understand and recompose their narratives. And these some of the exercise also in the exhibition of these recomposed narratives from the components that we've extracted from our analysis of each case. For example, this is time in which components of the apparatus, clocks, queuing systems, daylighting, establish a rhythm of continuities, discontinuities across days, months, seasons, and years, and time becomes here an instrument that regulates publicness, the presence and movement of bodies against their own time, biological, domestic, or professional. Protocols and practice, another example. So each place comes with its user manual, the rules that we have to follow in order for the transaction to be successful with the city, which does not mean that it's pleasant for either parties in the equation. Another example is delimitation. That one is in the exhibition, and this is the way in which the city territorializes itself through these dispositifs or apparatus. Drawings, to extend Nicolas de Monchaux's argument for maps, are at their most powerful, quote, when used not as instruments of unintended action or procedure, but rather as devices to change our perception of the world and our understanding of its possibilities, end quote. Drawing, in this sense, is a form of investigative analysis directed toward transformation. This is what we at least try to use drawing for in the project. And so if the first trajectory of documentation is the exhaustion and revelation of the subject, the second trajectory creates a new subject. Documentation is then propositional, directed toward a potential and desirable reality. Documentation becomes design, and the transformation of the subject is fully acknowledged in the work. If we think of this second trajectory of documentation, the inventory turned invention, a parallel can be made with what Bruno Latour writes of tracing associations. For him, politics enters the scene when we compose the associations we have traced. This composition is directed at designing a common world. And if design's main paradigm is to see the environment not as a given but as a project, then this position would suggest that the political project of observation and documentation, or in our case, municipal interfaces and their range of actors, is found in the way that we reassemble them. So in following these two trajectories, documentation is at the same time a contribution to shared knowledge and memory and the project for a renewed common sense and common world. To see these two trajectories as inseparable defines documentation as a political project, and more to the point for the 2 days we're here for, as a design project. Okay. Thank you. Putting my hat peut-être un micro, ça tu peux le faire.
Un, deux. Oui, ça marche. Okay. Merci, Thomas Bernard. I have a microphone, as you can tell. If anyone has a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you so Thomas Bernard can answer. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for that. Some of those drawings are really amazing. And,
thank you.
And we deal with some similar things. My only concern, I think, is why are there absolutely no people in your pictures and your drawings?
Yeah. It's a very question. Some of them, if we're starting to put them in, and I'm going to give you a very, very practical and down-to-earth answer. This is work in progress. that we, and I think if I go back to, for example, the library. So the first library. So if you, oh, it's a version. Oh, you can actually see them if you squint. The one that's presented in the exhibition has nobody in it. And my practical answer is that being a work in progress, we've put people in, and sometimes you put people for scale, but that's not the point. You want to put people in this type of drawing so that their actual agency kind of creates something and that makes you change the drawing. But we're not at that point yet. We've put people in the drawings and we haven't had time to kind of run through what scenarios are we actually depicting and how are they transforming the way we draw and the case we're looking at. I'm going to, I don't think we put them in, I think, but anyways, for example, it's a municipal court that's out there, and when we were about to print, I looked and there's a family there with kids, and I was okay, well, no, that's not where you go with the family. So I think we have to be so precise with the way we depict people and we depict interaction with these things, especially because they are about connecting the individual with the municipal apparatus, that it made sense right now to not show them until we are satisfied with that, actually that it makes sense. On another level, I think I could actually build up an argument why they might not be required by the drawing, because there's something I think neat about looking at as a very cold thing. The scale is there, the detail, they're drawn at 1 to 100. Obviously on the wall it's better, but the scale of it is already given by the detail of the drawing, and they are there as instruments to connect us to administration. So in a way, it might be too quaint sometimes to, like, as soon as we put people in, it might turn the argument somewhere that we may not want to go. So that's where we are. That's my.
Anyone for a question? Yes.
It's also true of the photographs, right? I mean, there's a couple of places in the photographs where will be like a jacket on a chair, so I think there's a kind of indication that somebody was sitting there, but I think there's a kind of a aesthetic and compositional choice to really clear the images. I thought that was really makes the photographs really powerful as a set, but it also it's a statement about what it is that you're trying to represent. So yeah. So anyway, I'm not sure where I'm going.
No,
with that
but I think I have two. Like I could have two answers in the same line. One, I think, and this may come up with a lot of our presentations, is the ethics of research. To photograph public buildings with people in them is nearly impossible. And actually, probably, so that's the first part. Is like we get access to these outside of office hours when there's no one. It's so much easier. You don't have to. And then again, I think on the photograph as a testimony of this, of the place, the observation that we can do by just visiting and taking notes can fill the space left by the the potential space that is vacant by the people and that are not appearing in the photographs. That might be a way of approaching it, but.
There's another question. We'll take one more question.
Okay, je vais être rapide.
Just make your answer short.
Oui, you should put 1 minute every time.
Okay, so you mentioned in your presentation that a lot of these spaces are designed by architecture offices, but they're never presented as part of their portfolio. And from the drawings and the presentation, we see a kind of, the way I understand it, at least, an insistence on kind of the operational aspect of all these spaces. I'm wondering, though, going back to that, like the fact that, let's say, the designers are not proud of those spaces, right? Have you thought about the reasons why that, the kind of ambiances that characterize the spaces and make them less attractive architecturally? I mean, beyond the kind of functional, like the kind of rational functionality, which is depicted in the axonometrics. There's the aspect of atmosphere, which is shown in the photographs. Were you able to, or have you considered kind of breaking that down in a different system?
Yeah, yes, there's a third part to the project which we haven't started, which is it touches a little bit on that part, which is to clearly recompose probably imaginary spaces that are based still on the same kind of aesthetic that these things have, that are quite, it's quite clear that when you speak to designers or when you speak to the city, that that let's say, to put it bluntly, like beauty does not come into it. Architectural space does not come into it. It's a functional space, and it's driven by cost-saving measures usually. And I would say it's so like we're trying to recompose, at least with the drawings and eventually with the third part, something that does find some beauty in these, because there's something quite charming when you look at them, all of them together. Maybe not a single elements, but all of them together start to have a certain language that we can kind of recuperate. I would think. It's a short answer, but we can.
Thank you. Merci Thomas
Merci.
Bernard.
On va mettre la prochaine.
Oui.